The Rosetta Stone is a granodiorite stela inscribed with a decree issued at Memphis, Egypt, in 196 BC on behalf of King Ptolemy V. The decree appears in 3 scripts. The upper text is ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the middle portion Demotic script, and the lowest ancient Greek. Because it presents essentially the same text in all 3 scripts, the stone provided the key to the modern understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The stone is believed to have originally been displayed within a temple, possibly at nearby Sais. It was probably moved during the early Christian or medieval period, and was eventually used as building material in the construction of Fort Julian near the town of Rashid in the Nile Delta. It was rediscovered there in 1799 by a soldier named Pierre-François Bouchard of the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt. It was the first ancient Egyptian bilingual text recovered in modern times, and it aroused widespread public interest with its potential to decipher this previously untranslated ancient language. Lithographic copies and plaster casts began circulating among European museums and scholars. Meanwhile, British troops defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, and the original stone came into British possession under the capitulation of Alexandria and was transported to London. It has been on public display at the British Museum almost continuously since 1802. It is the most visited object in the British Museum. Study of the decree was already underway when the first full translation of the Greek text appeared in 1803. It was 20 years, however, before the transliteration of the Egyptian scripts was announced by Jean-François Champollion in Paris in 1822. It took longer still before scholars were able to read ancient Egyptian inscriptions and literature confidently. Major advances in the decoding were recognition that the stone offered 3 versions of the same text, that the Demotic text used phonetic characters to spell foreign names, that the hieroglyphic text did so as well, and had pervasive similarities to the Demotic, and that, in addition to being used for foreign names, phonetic characters were also used to spell native Egyptian words. Ever since its rediscovery, the stone has been the focus of nationalist rivalries, including its transfer from French to British possession during the Napoleonic Wars, a long-running dispute over the relative value of Young and Champollion's contributions to the decipherment, and, since 2003, demands for the stone's return to Egypt. 2 other fragmentary copies of the same decree were discovered later, and several similar Egyptian bilingual or trilingual inscriptions are now known, including 2 slightly earlier Ptolemaic decrees. The Rosetta Stone is, therefore, no longer unique, but it was the essential key to modern understanding of ancient Egyptian literature and civilization. The term Rosetta Stone is now used in other contexts as the name for the essential clue to a new field of knowledge. Description: the Rosetta Stone is listed as a stone of black granite, bearing 3 inscriptions, found at Rosetta, in a contemporary catalogue of the artifacts discovered by the French expedition and surrendered to British troops in 1801. At some period after its arrival in London, the inscriptions on the stone were coloured in white chalk to make them more legible, and the remaining surface was covered with a layer of carnauba wax designed to protect the Rosetta Stone from visitors' fingers. This gave a dark color to the stone that led to its mistaken identification as black basalt. These additions were removed when the stone was cleaned in 1999, revealing the original dark gray tint of the rock, the sparkle of its crystalline structure, and a pink vein running across the top left corner. Comparisons with the Clem collection of Egyptian rock samples showed a close resemblance to rock from a small granodiorite quarry at Gebel Tingar on the west bank of the Nile, west of Elephantine in the region of Aswan. The pink vein is typical of granodiorite from this region. The Rosetta Stone is currently 112.3 centimeters high at its highest point, 75.7 centimeters wide, and 28.4 centimeters thick. It weighs approximately 760 kilograms. It bears 3 inscriptions. the top register in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the second in the Egyptian Demotic script, and the third in ancient Greek. The front surface is polished and the inscriptions lightly incised on it. The sides of the stone are smoothed, but the back is only roughly worked, presumably because this would have not been visible when it was erected. Original stela. The Rosetta Stone is a fragment of a larger stela. No additional fragments were found in later searches of the Rosetta site. Owing to its damaged state, none of the three texts is absolutely complete. The top register, composed of Egyptian hieroglyphs, suffered the most damage. Only the last 14 lines of the hieroglyphic text can be seen. All of them are broken on the right side, and 12 of them on the left. The following register of Demotic text has survived best. It has 32 lines, of which the first 14 are slightly damaged on the right side. The final register of Greek text contains 54 lines, of which the first 27 survive in full. The rest are increasingly fragmentary due to a diagonal break at the bottom right of the stone. The full length of the hieroglyphic text and the total size of the original stela, of which the Rosetta Stone is a fragment, can be estimated based on comparable stelae that have survived, including other copies of the same order. The slightly earlier decree of Canopus, erected in 238 BC during the reign of Ptolemy III, is 219 centimeters high and 82 centimeters wide, and contains 36 lines of hieroglyphic text, 73 of Demotic text, and 74 of Greek. The texts are of similar length. From such comparisons, it can be estimated that an additional 14 or 15 lines of hieroglyphic inscription are missing from the top register of the Rosetta Stone, amounting to be another 30 centimeters. In addition to the inscriptions, there would probably have been a scene depicting the king being presented to the gods, topped with a winged disc, as on the Canopus stela. These parallels, and a hieroglyphic sign for stela on the stone itself, suggest that it originally had a rounded top. The height of the original stela is estimated to have been about 149 centimeters. Memphis Decree in its context. The stela was erected after the coronation of King Ptolemy V and was inscribed with a decree that established the divine cult of the new ruler. The decree was issued by a congress of priests who gathered at Memphis. The date is given as 4 Xandicus in the Macedonian calendar and 18 Meshir in the Egyptian calendar, which corresponds to March 27, 196 BC. The year is stated as the 9th year of Ptolemy V's reign, and it is confirmed by naming 4 priests who officiated in that same year. Etas, son of Etas, was priest of the divine cult of Alexander the Great and the 5 Ptolemies down to Ptolemy V himself. His 3 colleagues, named in turn in the inscription, led the worship of Berenice Euergetus, Arsinoe Philadelphos, and Arsinoe Philopator, mother of Ptolemy V. However, a second date is also given in the Greek and hieroglyphic texts, corresponding to the 27th of November 197 BC, the official anniversary of Ptolemy's coronation. The inscription in Demotic conflicts with this, listing consecutive days in March for the decree and the anniversary. It is uncertain why such discrepancies exist, but it is clear that the decree was issued in 196 BC and that it was designed to re-establish the rule of the Ptolemaic kings over Egypt. The decree was issued during a turbulent period in Egyptian history. Ptolemy V Epiphanes reigned from 204 to 181 BC, the son of Ptolemy IV Philopator and his wife and sister Arsinoe. He had become ruler at the age of 5 after the sudden death of both of his parents, who were murdered in a conspiracy that involved Ptolemy IV's mistress Agathocles, according to contemporary sources. The conspirators effectively ruled Egypt as Ptolemy V's guardians until a revolt broke out 2 years later under General Ptolemy, when Agathocles and her family were lynched by a mob in Alexandria. Ptolemy, in turn, was replaced as guardian in 201 BC by Aristomenes of Alesia, who was chief minister at the time of the Memphis Decree. Political forces beyond the borders of Egypt exacerbated the internal problems of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Antiochus III the Great and Philip V of Macedon had made a pact to divide Egypt's overseas possessions. Philip had seized several islands and cities in Caria and Thrace, while the Battle of Panium had resulted in the transfer of Coel Syria, including Judea, from the Ptolemies to the Seleucids. Meanwhile, in the south of Egypt, there was a long-standing revolt that had begun during the reign of Ptolemy IV, led by Horwenifer and by his successor Anquenifer. Both the war and the internal revolt were still ongoing when the young Ptolemy V was officially crowned at Memphis at the age of 12, and the Memphis Decree issued. The stela is a late example of a class of donation, stelae, which depicts the reigning monarch granting a tax exemption to the resident priesthood. Pharaohs had erected these stelae over the previous 2,000 years, the earliest examples dating from the Egyptian Old Kingdom. In earlier periods, all such decrees were issued by the king himself, but the Memphis Decree was issued by the priests, as the maintainers of traditional Egyptian culture. The decree records that Ptolemy V gave a gift of silver and grain to the temples. It also records that there was particularly high flooding of the Nile in the 8th year of his reign, and he had the excess waters dammed for the benefit of the farmers. In return for these concessions, the priesthood pledged that the king's birthday and coronation days would be celebrated annually, and that all the priests of Egypt would serve him alongside the other gods. The decree concludes with the instruction that a copy was to be placed in every temple, inscribed in the language of the gods, the language of documents, and the language of the Greeks, as used by the Ptolemaic government. Securing the favor of the priesthood was essential for the Ptolemaic kings to retain effective rule over the populace. The high priests of Memphis, where the king was crowned, were particularly important, as they were the highest religious authority of the time and had influence throughout the kingdom. Given that the decree was issued at Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, rather than Alexandria, the center of government of the ruling Ptolemies, it is evident that the young king was anxious to gain their active support. Hence, although the government of Egypt had been Greek-speaking ever since the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Memphis Decree, like the two preceding decrees in the series, included texts in Egyptian to display its relevance to the general populace by way of the literate Egyptian priesthood. There exists no one definitive English translation of the decree because of the minor differences between the three original texts, and because modern understanding of the ancient languages continues to develop. An up-to-date translation by R.S. Simpson appears on the British Museum website, based on the Demotic text. It can be compared with Edwin R. Bevan's full translation in the House of Ptolemy, based on the Greek text with footnote comments on variations between this and the two Egyptian texts. The stela almost certainly did not originate in the town of Rashid where it was found, but more likely came from a temple site farther inland, possibly the royal town of Sais. The temple from which it originally came was probably closed around AD 392 when Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius I ordered the closing of all non-Christian temples of worship. The original stela broke at some point, its largest piece becoming what we now know as the Rosetta Stone. Ancient Egyptian temples were later used as quarries for new construction, and the Rosetta Stone probably was reused in this manner. Later it was incorporated in the foundations of a fortress constructed by the Mameluke Sultan Qaitbay Bey to defend the Baal-Batine branch of the Nile at Rashid. There it lay for at least another 3 centuries until its rediscovery. 2 other inscriptions of the Memphis Decrees have been found since the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, the Nubari Stela, and an inscription found at the Temple of Philae. Unlike the Rosetta Stone, their hieroglyphic inscriptions were relatively intact. The inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone had been deciphered long before the discovery of the other copies of the decree, but subsequent Egyptologists including Wallace Budge, used these other inscriptions to further refine the actual hieroglyphs that must have been used in the lost portions of the hieroglyphic register on the Rosetta Stone. Rediscovery. On Napoleon's 1798 campaign in Egypt, the Expeditionary Army was accompanied by the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, a corps of 167 technical experts. On July 15, 1799, French soldiers under the command of Colonel d'Hautpoul were strengthening the defences of Fort Julien, a couple of miles northeast of the Egyptian port city of Rosetta. Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard spotted a slab with inscriptions on one side that the soldiers had uncovered. He and d'Hautpoul saw at once that it might be important and informed General Jacques-François Menou, who happened to be at Rosetta. The find was announced to Napoleon's newly founded scientific association in Cairo, the Institut d'Égyptie, in a report by Commission member Michel-Ange Lancret noting that it contained 3 inscriptions, the first in hieroglyphs and the third in Greek, and rightly suggesting that the 3 inscriptions would be versions of the same text. Lancret's report, dated July 19, 1799, was read to a meeting of the Institute soon after July 25. Bouchard, meanwhile, transported the stone to Cairo for examination by scholars. Napoleon himself inspected what had already begun to be called La Pierre de Rosette, the Rosetta Stone, shortly before his return to France in August 1799. The discovery was reported in September in Courrier de l'Égyptie, the official newspaper of the French expedition. The anonymous reporter expressed a hope that the stone might one day be the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. In 1800, 3 of the Commission's technical experts devised ways to make copies of the texts on the stone. One of these experts was Jean-Joseph Marcel, a printer and gifted linguist, who is credited as the first to recognize that the middle text was written in the Egyptian Demotic script, rarely used for stone inscriptions and seldom seen by scholars at that time, rather than Syriac as had originally been thought. It was artist and inventor Nicolas Jacques Conté who found a way to use the stone itself as a printing block. A slightly different method for reproducing the inscriptions was adopted by Antoine Galland. The prints that resulted were taken to Paris by General Charles Dugois. Scholars in Europe were now able to see the inscriptions and attempt to read them. After Napoleon's departure, French troops held off British and Ottoman attacks for another 18 months. In March 1801, the British landed at Aboukir Bay. General Jacques-François Menou had been one of the first to see the stone in 1799, and he was now in command of the French expedition. His troops, including the Commission, marched north towards the Mediterranean coast to meet the enemy, transporting the stone along with other antiquities of all kinds. Menou was defeated in battle, and the remnant of his army retreated to Alexandria where they were surrounded and besieged. The stone now inside the city, he admitted defeat and surrendered on August 30.